Hello and welcome. You watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you with all the top news stories from around the globe. Let's get started. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has once again emphasized on the need for United Nations Security Council reform while elaborating on why India deserves a seat at the high table. Speaking at the Raisina Dialogue in Delhi, the minister said the short-sighted approach of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council is holding back forward movement in the long-pending reform of the global body. Significantly, he added that the biggest opponent of UNSC reform is not a Western country, in remarks seen as an oblique reference to China. The External Affairs Minister said the sentiment for changes in the UN system is very strong, but the challenge has been to get the concurrence for it from certain quarters. He stated, if you're going to ask 5 countries saying, would you mind changing the rules that you would have less power? Guess what the answer is going to be. If they are wise, the answer would be something else. If they are short-sighted, the answer is what it is today. Jaishankar argued that there is a larger global rebalancing that is bigger than the UN. And this is also about how rules have been gamed. He said the fact is that the world trading rules have been gamed. We have a lot of challenges today that also emanate from how countries have used that for their benefit at the expense of the international system. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are Russia, the United Kingdom, China, France and the United States. And these countries can veto any substantive resolution. There has been growing demand for a long time now to increase the number of permanent members to reflect the contemporary global reality. India, Brazil, South Africa, Germany and Japan are strong contenders for permanent membership of the UN Security Council, which has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Dr. Jaishankar made another important argument. He said, when the UN was founded, it had approximately 50 members. Today, we have 4 times the members. So it's a common sense proposition that you cannot continue the same way when you have 4 times the members. He also said if you look at the last 5 years, all the big issues, we've not been able to find multilateral solutions. So the results or lack of results demonstrates the case for reform. Asked about various complex geopolitical challenges and diverse positions on them by key nations, he said the endeavor has to be to find middle ground. The minister said, let's get the totality of the problem. I think the reality is we will have to battle bit by bit to create groups which push for change. On many issues, you will get different combinations of countries and we will have to live with a long period of incremental progress before we get to some kind of landing point. Jaishankar also spoke about how multilateralism exists alongside national interests, pointing to India's experience with the fallout of the decision to take the Kashmir dispute to the United Nations soon after independence. Responding to a question on whether countries could compromise on values but not on interests, Jaishankar said, this wasn't something new. And I quote him, look at our own example. Very literally, in our first year of independence, we put our trust in multilateralism and took the Kashmir aggression issue to the United Nations. And others made it into an accession issue, and they did it for geopolitical reasons. It's not that we should be against multilateralism. Multilateralism is a kind of lowest common denominator, and anything above that, it will exist side by side with national interests, with the calculations and competitions of countries.
The UN, when the UN was invented, it had at least about approximately 50 members. We have 4 times the members. So it's a common sense proposition that you can't continue the same way when you have 4 times the members. We use the UN very often to illustrate that point. We've also seen, if you look at the last 5 years, all the big issues. In a way, we have not been able to find multilateral solutions. So the results are also, or the lack of results demonstrate the case for reform. But there's a larger, I think, global conversation and a global rebalancing as well, which is bigger than the UN. which is really, whose rules, how does it work? Because what has also happened is in many cases, the rules have been gamed. We have today, we speak about globalization, for example, and the fact is that the world trading rules have been gamed. And we have a lot of our challenges today also emanate from how countries have used that for their benefit at the expense of the international system. The idea that everybody would agree on the most important issues of the day is a bit of a fantasy. The fact is, competition is for real. You spoke about camp politics. Sometimes there's a logic to it. President Quiroga spoke about, how institutions are, antiquated and sticking with the old rules. I agree, but I think in addition to the old issues, there are also the new issues. I mean, if today there is, let us say, take the big debates of the day, connectivity, debt, trade. Now, how these are leveraged today. These are not necessarily all coming out of the West. So, the West, as the dominant force earlier, is largely responsible for what, where we are today. But I think the new players haven't helped. I mean, again, if you take UN Security Council reform, the biggest opposer is not a Western country. So, let's get the totality of the problem right. So I think the reality is we'll have to battle bit by bit to create groups which will push for change. I would say, on many issues, you will get different combinations of countries. And we'll have to live with a long period of incremental progress before we get to some kind of landing point, because as Anwar Gargash said, you're not going to get a second San Francisco conference.
All right, so some very significant and interesting statements made there by India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, while speaking at the Raisina Dialogue here in New Delhi. Of course, the biggest takeaway being that it is high time that the UN Security Council undergoes some much-needed reforms, and he made a strong case, yet again, for why India deserves a seat at the high table. Let's dissect these comments with our panel of experts. Joining me on Global Lens tonight is Ambassador Dilip Sinha, former permanent representative of India to the United Nations in Geneva. So welcome to Global Lens. Great to have you on the show. We're also joined by Professor Rajan Kumar, Associate Professor at the School of International Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Rajan Kumar, great to have you back with us. Later on the show, we'll also be joined by Ambassador S.R. Tayal, former Indian diplomat. Ambassador Dilip Sinha, let me start with you. So you have, of course, represented India at the United Nations. Today we are talking about the UN Security Council. This isn't the first time that India has talked about the need for UNSC to undergo some much needed reforms, or the fact that India deserves a seat at the high table. But looking at some of the statements that have been made by Dr. S. Jaishankar at the Raisina Dialogue, he says, if you're going to ask these 5 permanent members whether they would be willing to let go of some of their power, guess what their answer is going to be? If they are wise, the answer would be something else. If they are short-sighted, the answer would be what it is today. But what really leapt out at me is this one comment he made where he said the biggest opponent of UNSC reform is not a Western country. It certainly does look like the minister is referring to China. What are your thoughts, sir, on what the External Affairs Minister has said?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. The statement of Dr. Jaishankar is really very significant. Here he has made a very broad-based statement on India's approach to multilateral institutions today. And what is important about it is that he has pursued a realpolitik analysis rather than being dogmatic and repetitive of the earlier statements that we tend to make. Here he has really got to the crux of the problem, and he has made some very important statements in the course of his analysis, pointing out the problems as they exist and which we need to look at very carefully. For example, he has talked about that the progress has to be incremental. You cannot think about a big ticket reform. There cannot be a new San Francisco conference. So progress has to be incremental. Then progress cannot be only confined to the Security Council. It is a question of progress in various institutions, because globalization has made the global structure extremely complex. And there are various multilateral institutions operating today regulating globalization. And progress has to be made in all these separately. And then he has pointed out that the groupings have to be issue-based, that you don't really have, although the world is at the political level become increasingly bipolar today, yet when it comes to reforming global institutions, then the groupings will be formed on issues and there'll be different kinds of coalitions being formed. And then, of course, he referred to the point that you referred to about Security Council reform. And here he pointed out quite correctly that the obstruction to the reform of the Security Council today comes not from the West, but from China and also Russia. One must remember also that Russia also, although it has supported India tangentially, never really very clearly, China, of course, is quite strongly opposed to it. But the fact is that the stand of both these countries is such that any proposal for reform in the Security Council will get opposed by these two countries. So one has to keep that in mind. And in this whole totality of statements, what the External Affairs Minister has pointed out is that we have to be, number one, extremely realistic about the kind of progress we can make. We should not have very high ambitions. We should move slowly, and we have to make our groupings based upon the issues as they come up.
Okay. Ambassador Sinha, focusing at the moment specifically on the issue of the long pending UNSC reform. Like I said, India has been crying itself hoarse for years now, talking about how, it's the most populous nation in the world, and for multiple reasons, also given our growing contribution now, to the international community in multiple ways. We do deserve a seat at the high table. But let me ask you a direct question. You're a diplomat. I don't know how direct your answer would be, but I'm a journalist, so I can take this liberty. You made an interesting point just now. You said it's not just China, even Russia's support has been at best tangential. But I want to ask you this. It is a well-known fact that India and Russia have a very long-standing, robust relationship, one that Dr. Jaishankar has gone out of his way to defend in the last 2 years since the Russia-Ukraine war erupted at one international forum after another, in the face of criticism from the West, especially the Western media, especially with regard to our Russian oil purchases. He has talked about how, Russia is a valued friend, Russia has never hurt our interests. And of course, we've also seen how President Putin, every few weeks, praises Prime Minister Modi and his leadership, refers to him as a friend. Given that India is actually one of the handful of countries that seems to have stood by Russia and not condemned it for its invasion of Ukraine, despite all the pressures that we faced from the West. And let's not forget what happened at the G20 summit last September here in New Delhi. If there's one country that managed to actually get a unanimous adoption of a joint statement, in this case the New Delhi Declaration, where there was no reference to Russia and its aggression in Ukraine, it was India. My direct question to you, therefore, is, knowing whatever China's position may be, isn't it time India extracted its pound of flesh from Russia?
Well, exactly as the External Affairs Minister pointed out, we have to deal with all countries, and on certain issues we would make common cause with countries, on certain issues we would not. So with Russia, we make common cause on the issue of security. A lot of our defense purchases come from Russia. On certain strategic issues, we concur with Russia, but on so many others, we differ with Russia. Now, in the case of the Ukraine resolution that you talked about, India did not support Russia. India did not oppose the resolution. India merely abstained. And that was because of India's long-standing policy that on these issues, India seeks to find middle ground to see if there can be a resolution to the problem through peaceful means, through diplomatic
My apologies
means.
for interrupting you there, sir. While you're right that, at various UN Security Council votes, India abstained, and that itself, frankly, was seen as a sign of support for Russia. But I was actually referring to the G20 Summit New Delhi Declaration that was adopted last September, where even the United States finally agreed to sign on the dotted line, and this is a joint statement that did not even make a reference of Russia in the context of the Ukraine war, did not even refer to Russia. This hadn't even happened in Bali.
Well, this was a great success of our diplomacy. We were able to cobble a resolution that was able to pass muster with the Western countries and was acceptable to Russia. Now, as I said, it was the skill of our diplomats who were engaged in drafting this, but it was essentially a compromise declaration, which both countries, there's a language that one uses in diplomatic negotiations, can you live with a resolution? Which means the West said they could live with the resolution and Russia said they could also live with the resolution. But we must also keep in mind that this was done by these countries because they also did not want to embarrass India and see a G20 meeting that would fail on Indian soil, which was good of them. But the fact remains that the adoption of the resolution did not mean that we had found a solution to the crisis. The war continues to rage in Ukraine. So that was essentially a compromise by both sides to enable a declaration to be adopted. But the declaration had really practically no impact on the conflict, nor did it have show any direction towards which one can move to resolve the conflict.
Unfortunately, that seems to be the state of affairs as far as the UN itself is concerned. A lot of cynics seem to believe that the UN itself is a toothless body today because as we speak, there are at least two major wars going on around the world, from Russia-Ukraine, which is about to enter its third year, to the Israel-Hamas war, where thousands and thousands of people have died. And frankly, the United Nations has been able to do precious little to stop those wars or prevent the killing of innocents. Thanks for your intervention, sir. We will continue this conversation with Ambassador Sinha and our other guests on the other side of this quick break on Global Lens. Here's a very important reminder. We are counting down to the big event that News9 is organizing this coming weekend. The News9 Global Summit is about the new India that's recognized as a rising economic power and a major global player. The theme of the summit is how India is poised for the next big leap. The What India Sings Today summit is being organized by the TV9 group, and this edition of the summit is unmissable because the keynote address will be delivered by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What India Sings Today summit will be held in New Delhi on the 25th and 26th of February. Don't miss it.
From fragile 5 to top 5, from a laggard to a leader, India under Modi has reimagined the world order. Presenting the second edition of TV9, What India Thinks Today. Summit theme, India poised for the next big leap. Listen to Prime Minister Modi unveil his vision for Viksit Bharat at News9 Global Summit, a TV9 network initiative.
Presented by Poonawalla FinCorp, Enabling Dreams. Co-powered by Sugar Free, एक छोटा सा चेंज फॉर फिटनेस. बनेगा तो बढ़ेगा इंडिया. अल्ट्राटेक देश का नंबर 1 सीमेंट. नो स्ट्रेस फिनोलेक्स. प्रिया गोल्ड बटर डिलाइट बिस्किट्स कलौंजी के साथ मक्खन का तड़का. स्पेशल पार्टनर प्रभु जी, मिठाई हो या नमकीन, बस मौका चाहिए जी. सर्वोकॉन ट्रांसफॉर्मर एंड स्टेबलाइजर, रखे सब कंट्रोल में. सर्वोकॉन.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. We're talking about India's External Affairs Minister's latest comments on the need for UNSC reform. Let me now go across to Professor Rajan Kumar. Professor Kumar, thanks for waiting patiently. Now, Dr. Jaishankar has made a series of interesting statements. Of course, he says, at the time when the UN was founded, it had barely 50 members. Now it has 4 times the number, and therefore it's a common sense proposition that you cannot continue the same way. Now, this is of course an argument that's been made multiple times, but here's what I find particularly interesting. He says, if you look at the last 5 years, all the big issues, we have not been able to find multilateral solutions. So the results or the lack of results demonstrates the case for reform. Not only does it demonstrate the case for reform, like I said in the earlier segment, Professor Rajan, there are many who say today that the very fact that you have multiple wars going on in the world as we speak actually goes to show how toothless and ineffective the United Nations has really been.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here again. And I completely agree with you that United Nations is becoming irrelevant organization today. And External Affairs Minister Jaishankar is referring to 2-3 points in specific. First, he said that how the world is becoming multipolar, new players are emerging, new issues are emerging. But all these countries, these 5 privileged members, they pay lip service to the issue of reform. But when it comes to actual reform, no member is serious about the issue. And there are several blocks within that United Nations Security Organization, so that has become a real problem. He also referred to the second point, which is again very interesting. And since we are using the term multilateralism, he said that the games of trade, the trade rules have been gamed. That's the exact term that he used. What he's basically referring to is the failure of the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO. What is happening in the last few years, that last 25 years, the WTO has been the mechanism through which the world was trading. But of late, the US is not appointing judges for the appellate body in the WTO. As a consequence, the quorum of judges required for any dispute settlement is not working. So that's what he's referring to. Third, this issue that new players have emerged, and he is saying that India, Brazil, South Africa, a number of countries from the global south, also Japan, Germany included, they have become a very important player, and the world has become multipolar, but that does not reflect in the UN system, which still caters to the post-World War II kind of situation. And last year, I remember that Ruchira Kamboj, who was the permanent representative of India she lashed out at the UN in a very critical terms, in a very angry tone, where she said that the UN has become anachronistic. And she clearly said that these 5 nations, they are disrespecting 188 other members, and even the UN Charter has not been changed. If you see the UN Charter, that even names today of permanent members are like Soviet Union. The name has not been changed. It says Republic of China. They're not the Republic of China refers to the other China. So she clearly pointed out that how this organization, United Nations, has become ineffective, and why United Nations, failed to respond to the crisis that the world was facing in the last few years, be it the COVID crisis. We have seen the kind of divisions during the COVID crisis. The Western countries did not supply the vaccines to other countries. So COVID crisis, it didn't work very well. United States during the Trump, they stopped funding the WHO, etc. So that was an issue. The second Ukrainian crisis, and during the Ukraine crisis, United Nations Security Council was supposed to play a very stellar role in negotiation on the issue of human rights, on the issue of ceasefire, etc. That has not happened. Recently, we have seen that in the issue of Israel, how the Western countries created a discourse which is totally opposed by the large number of countries from the global south, including Russia and China. But UNSC could do nothing, because the UNSC today is a very divided body. It is not a representative body. It is not an inclusive body. It privileges some over the other, and which in today's context is totally unacceptable. UN does have a system of reform. The Article 109, it clearly says that there should be a review of UN system every 10 years. But unfortunately, that is not happening. We have started the process of what is known as intergovernmental negotiations since 2008, that UN does that. But even after 15, 16 years, the real issue of reform is not making any progress. So as a consequence, what he is referring to, basically he's saying that that how the Western countries have dominated this UN system, and Western countries and also some of the other privileged members, including China and Russia. So they do pay lip service, but when it comes to actual reforms, they are not serious about the issue.
Well, it is quite clear they're not serious about the issue. However, what's really interesting is that, Dr. Jaishankar has made a reference to China as being the biggest opposer of UNSC reform. He didn't name the country. He said the biggest opponent is not a Western country. No prizes for guessing. He is referring to China. And yes, talking about the toothlessness of the UN Security Council, all you have to do is take a look at the multiple resolutions that have been introduced there in recent days, asking for a ceasefire in Gaza. All that the United States has to do is to veto every such resolution, and as a result the war continues. It's gone on for 5 months now. Thousands and thousands of innocents have been killed, and the world, including the UNSC, are just watching as mute spectators. We'll continue this conversation on the other side of this break on Global Lens. Here's another programming note. We are counting down to the big event that News9 is organizing this coming weekend. The News9 Global Summit is about the new India that's recognized as a rising economic power and a major global player. The theme of that summit is how India is poised for the next big leap. The What India Thinks Today Summit is being organized by the TV9 Group, and this edition of the summit is unmissable because the keynote address will be delivered by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. What India Thinks Today Summit will be held in New Delhi on the 25th and 26th of February. Don't forget to tune in.
Bangalore traffic is an example of something that has gone wrong with our system.
We have more than 50 flyovers in Bangalore city. If flyover is a solution to traffic problem, Bangalore should not have traffic problem.
According to TomTom Traffic Index 2022, Bangalore is ranked as the second worst city in the world when it comes to traffic.
The speed limit at the ORR is 80 kilometers per hour, but our vehicle has only moved 10 kilometers per hour.
What Bangalore needs is a surgery, but what we have been offered repeatedly are band-aids.
Only on the world's first news OTT. News9 Plus, ahead of the curve.
From fragile 5 to top 5, from a laggard to a leader, India under Modi has reimagined the world order. Presenting the second edition of TV9, What India Thinks Today. Summit theme, India poised for the next big leap. Listen to Prime Minister Modi unveil his vision for Viksit Bharat at News9 Global Summit, a TV9 network initiative.
Presented by Poonawalla FinCorp, enabling dreams. Co-powered by Sugar Free, एक छोटा सा चेंज फॉर फिटनेस. बनेगा तो बढ़ेगा इंडिया. अल्ट्राटेक देश का नंबर 1 सीमेंट. नो स्ट्रेस फिनोलेक्स. प्रिया गोल्ड बटर डिलाइट बिस्किट्स कलौंजी के साथ मक्खन का तड़का. स्पेशल पार्टनर प्रभु जी, मिठाई हो या नमकीन, बस मौका चाहिए जी. सर्वोकॉन ट्रांसफॉर्मर एंड स्टेबलाइजर, रखे सब कंट्रोल में. सर्वोकॉन.
I try and convert almost everything in a kind of a mathematical formula.
You should always stretch more than you can reach.
Listening is very important.
But if you don't listen, how would you know what the problem is?
Everybody who's working in and around me, their personal well-being is also responsibility that I carry.
Great leaders have shared vision.
This and more. Streaming on News9 Plus. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
It's probably the best kept secret
in India.
Family-owned business, which has been extremely clinical in their approach. They have not hesitated ever to kill their darlings.
Typical to a South Indian business empire, I think they've shunned the limelight almost deliberately.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and we're talking about India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar's latest remarks on the need for long-pending UNSC reform. All right. Ambassador S.R. Tayal is also joining us at this point, but since Ambassador Sinha has to leave the show, do we have him at this point, Ambassador Sinha? Okay, we will go across to him in a moment, but Ambassador Tayal, let me come to you, sir. Welcome back to Global Lens. Dr. Jaishankar has made a series of interesting points. He's talked about how the UNSC is caught in a time warp. At the time of its founding, there were 50 members. Now it's 4 times the number, and yet there's been no reform. You still have just 5 nations that are calling the shots, and the rest of the world seems to be at their mercy. Nobody is serious about UNSC reform because none of these 5 members seem to want to let go of the power that they enjoy. But what I found particularly interesting is Dr. Jaishankar saying that the biggest opponent of UNSC reform is not a Western country. Now, the reference is clearly to China. What do you make of that? And the fact that there is also Russia in that grouping, which India supposedly has excellent relations with. Isn't it time we tapped into that relationship and maybe leveraged it a bit further to take our case forward as far as a permanent seat of the UN Security Council is concerned, especially considering the fact that in the last 2 years since Russia invaded Ukraine, India frankly is one of a handful of countries that have still maintained very friendly ties with that country and not once condemned it for that invasion.
External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar's remarks are very well crafted and they are very realistic because he has pointed out how multilateral organizations, including UN Security Council, is ineffective. Then there are new issues which UN system is not addressing. And he has made this point that while still West is dominant, but even the new players are being like the members of the old club, and of course the hint was towards China. And then he goes on to say right, that create groups to change and different combinations of countries to deal with different problems. There will be incremental progress, and at some point, the landing point will come, which has not yet come. So it is a very, very realistic assessment. You are right that yes, with Russia we have excellent relations, and Russia has endorsed our membership for UN, permanent membership for UN Security Council. But when it comes to multilateral organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS, always China manages that some language is there which does not fully endorse India's candidature as a full member of the UN Security Council. But at the same time, then China is also stopping the candidature of African countries or Latin American countries. So in a sense, it is blocking any expansion of permanent membership of the UN Security Council, just because it does not want India, and of course it also does not want Japan to become permanent members. And the ulterior motive of China is that in Indo-Pacific, in East Asia, in Asia, it does not want any other country to become equal to China in the United Nations system, in the multilateral system. And that is why it is blocking India and Japan for permanent membership of the UN Security Council. So this will be a long game, and the External Affairs Minister has very realistically said in the last part of his statement that progress will be incremental, but we keep on plugging at it. At some point will come where the reality will have to be accepted.
Where the reality will have to be accepted. And of course, he's talked about how short-sighted this approach is. But, you know, going by what you've just said, Ambassador, I think it would be quite safe to say, even for multiple other reasons, that China really seems to be the biggest global challenge today, not just for India, but, you know, for countries around the world. Let me now go back to Ambassador Dilip Sinha. Ambassador Sinha, I know you have to leave, so I'll ask you this final question, sir, before we let you go. You know, Dr. Jaishankar also made some interesting comments about multilateralism that you referred to earlier. And he said, look at our own example. Literally in the first year of our independence, we put our trust in multilateralism, took the Kashmir aggression issue to the UN. And look what happened. Others made it into an accession issue, and they did it for geopolitical reasons. Then he goes on to say it's not like we're against multilateralism. It'll exist side by side with national interests, with the calculations and competitions of countries. But, you know, significantly he says that you look at any major issue of the last 5 years, the UN has not been able to find any multilateral solutions to any of those complex issues. So that also brings us to the point that many are now beginning to make about not just the toothlessness, but the near irrelevance of the United Nations today. How do you look at that?
You know, when you look at the United Nations, one has to keep in mind that one is looking at different issues, and that is what the External Affairs Minister also pointed out. When you look at maintenance of peace and security and the Security Council, yes, what you say is absolutely correct. But that is the way the Security Council was designed, where each of the permanent members was given a veto, because the idea was that unless the big powers act together, if they act at cross purposes, then there'll be another world war. So the Security Council was designed to act only in small cases where the big powers would agree. If the big powers themselves were involved in a conflict, as they are today, China, Russia, America, they are either threatening war or they are involved in wars directly or indirectly. The Security Council cannot act against them because it was not designed to do so. But on the other issues, the UN has played a certain amount of role. For example, whether it is in refugee relief or in some developmental issues, health issues, etc. So it has a limited, it is not a world government. It is, after all, an association of sovereign countries. So it's only when sovereign countries agree upon certain issues, and they agree upon small issues which are where you can make incremental progress, which again the External Affairs Minister pointed out, that we cannot make such sweeping judgments as to dismiss the UN completely. We need the UN because the world today is far too intertwined, far too interconnected for it not to have multilateral institutions. But any progress in these institutions will be very slow to very difficult negotiations, and we have to keep at it. In peace and security, things are much more difficult, and there, of course, we have to accept that there is a real world in which global power politics plays out, as it did in the case of the Kashmir issue, which we took to the UN way back in the 1940s. So that situation continues in the Security Council, as you can see in the case of Ukraine, Syria, Palestine, and other places. So that is the reality of the world today, and we have to live with it.
We have to live with it. Well, talking about change vis-a-vis the United Nations, it seems to take place at glacial pace, if at all. But yes, of course, there is a case to be made about how the world still needs the United Nations, all its failings notwithstanding. On that note, Ambassador Dilip Sinha, thank you very much, sir, for joining me on Global Lens tonight. Okay, let me now go back to my other panelist, Professor Rajan Kumar. You know, looking at the larger debate around the effectiveness or relevance of the United Nations itself, of course, there are cogent arguments that have been made on both sides of the fence. There are many who nowadays say that it's just lost its relevance, the world body, because at least in the arena of peace and security, it seems to have completely failed, especially when you look at its failure to prevent wars. I put this question to Stéphane Dujarric, the spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, when he was here in New Delhi for the G20 summit, and his response was that I will, ask all the critics and cynics who say the UN should not exist anymore for all its failings. The question I want to ask them is, can you imagine a world without the United Nations? You may be very unhappy with its failings, but I can assure you that without a world body like the United Nations, the world would be a much, much worse place. So while even he agreed that the UN Security Council reform is desperately needed and the functioning of this particular body leaves a lot to be desired, there are other, UN organizations that continue to play a very important role around the world, and it is something that only a world body like the United Nations can do, and therefore we cannot be dismissive of a multilateral institution such as this. It's a complex argument, you would agree. The question is, how do we see progress going forward on this front?
I think, Nehaji, nobody is arguing for throwing the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Nobody is saying that we should not have the United Nations. Let me tell you that forget about India. India has always said that India believes in the rule of law, international rule of law, and which basically means the kind of rule of law which has been created by multilateral institutions, United Nations included. But not only India. If you see the resolutions passed by BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, etc., even Russia and China, they argue that they believe in rule of law. The question comes that how do you define the rule of law? If it comes to implementation of certain issues, for instance, how do you implement the laws which have been passed by the General Assembly, and how the rules passed by the General Assembly has been contradicted by some of the permanent members. So there are internal contradictions within the UN. The demand of India is to believes in rule of law without any doubt. It has played very important role in the United Nations peacekeeping operations, etc. We have lost several soldiers. So all of that is there. But we are asking for the reform of the institution. See, politically speaking, theoretically speaking, what happens? There are three choices for a country like India. One is, exit. The second is voicing the concern. And third is creating parallel institutions. So India does not want to exit from the United Nations, and that's for sure. Even China does not want to. China is one of the biggest beneficiaries of UN system, let me tell you. And US played a very fundamental role in promoting China for a very long time. Even China doesn't want to get out of this United Nations system. So important thing is the second option that we have, and the third option, which is voicing the concern. So what we are saying, India, Japan, Brazil, South Africa, a lot of other countries from the global south, that we need immediate reform of the United Nations to make it more representative, to make it more inclusive, so that it can address to the new issues which are emerging, be it climate change, be it terrorism, be it the crisis in Gaza, ceasefire, etc. So we are saying that these issues can be tackled in a better way if new members are included and if they start playing a very important role. The third option, as I told you, is the option of creating parallel institutions. I have written an article on multilateralism. It's available globally. There I argue that what these countries have done, because they are not reforming, the Western countries dominated multilateral institutions, be it WTO, United Nations, nuclear regimes, etc. So these countries have started creating parallel institutions. Why, for instance, the G20 has become suddenly important? Why, for instance, this BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organizations have emerged? They have emerged to address to the specific issues which are emerging at the global and the regional level, and which are not being tackled by the United Nations and multilateral institutions. So what I'm trying to say that we have to reform the United Nations and other multilateral institutions like WTO or UNDP. There are a lot of other institutions where the WHO, etc., which need reform. Otherwise, they cannot play the role the way it was expected to play when these institutions were started.
Absolutely. You certainly need reform at the WTO too, and frankly, as far as the WHO is concerned, I'm again not suggesting that we don't need that organization, but it did not cover itself in glory during the COVID pandemic. So the WHO also, in a sense, had a lot of explaining to do during that time. Ambassador Tayal, I'll give you the last word as we wrap up this conversation. Of course, Professor Rajan Kumar is right in pointing out how we've seen over the years the emergence of parallel multilateral institutions such as the SCO, BRICS and the G20, not only because they are meant to address a lot of regional issues and concerns, but also perhaps as a direct result of the frustration and disgruntlement that many countries have felt with the functioning of the United Nations. Do you believe that's where the answer lies? That if you cannot have, the UNSC reform that you want or need in the immediate or foreseeable future, then let's strengthen other parallel multilateral institutions?
Yes, I think so. The UN system is now almost 80 years old and it has become obsolescent, it is aging and it needs to be reinvented really. But all the members have to come together, and the way the whole world is divided at present, and so many wars going on, this is really not the time where there can be any kind of a consensus for any major reform in the UN system. So that reality should be accepted. And given that reality, the option is to activate more younger organizations like G20, even SCO, in my view, is not that has not really achieved much. If you really see they come out with very, very long and verbose statements running into hundreds of paragraphs. But if you ask what exactly has been their actual delivery, I have my doubts. That way, G20 perhaps could be a more effective, at least a forum for exchange of views, for a lot of back channel diplomacy and bilateral talks away from the camera. But they cannot really deliver in the way a multilateral formal body like United Nations can. So, but there can be understandings or some kind of agreements which can be crafted and drafted in a G20 kind of a setup, but ultimately they will have to be formally adopted, executed or operated under the UN system. So UN system has to stay, as the professor said, till something else takes its place. But that will come only after the major jolt is there. But I hope there is not a major jolt like the ILO, like the League of Nations disappeared after the, and it led to a World War. So
yes,
sense prevails. That is our hope, and I think that is what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar also said, that incremental progress in subgroups, smaller groups, as much as possible, and in the hope that at some point United Nations itself will get reformed.
Let's certainly hope that happens someday in our lifetimes. And while, of course, one cannot compare a G20 bloc to the United Nations, but I have to agree with Professor Rajan Kumar about how blocs like the G20 have emerged as very important multilateral institutions in recent times, and what better example of the democratization of a multilateral institution and of leveling the playing field than the fact that at India's initiative, the African Union was granted full membership of the G20 at the G20 summit held right here in New Delhi just a few months ago. On that note, Ambassador Dilip Sinha, Professor Rajan Kumar, Ambassador S.R. Tayal, thank you so much to all of you for joining me on Global Lens tonight. All right, let's now turn our attention to this rather disturbing story from the United States. Janvi Kandula, a 23-year-old Indian student, was killed after being hit by a speeding police vehicle in the US state of Washington on the 23rd of January last year. After a year of legal battles, court proceedings, statements from the Indian and US governments, and calls for accountability, the police officer behind the wheels of the vehicle that ran over Kandula now will walk free. Despite acknowledging the impact on communities both locally and across the world, a US prosecutor claimed a lack of sufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges against Seattle police officer Kevin Dave, who was driving at 120 kilometers per hour when his car hit Janvi, a master's student in Seattle from Andhra Pradesh. In body cam footage that was released by Seattle police, Officer Daniel Orderer, who was not involved in the collision but was present at the scene, callously laughed about the deadly crash before dismissing the need for a criminal investigation and making insensitive comments about Janvi's age and value. The King County prosecuting attorney expressed her concerns about Orderer's comments, calling them appalling and deeply troubling. However, she said, as egregious as his remarks were, they do not alter the legal analysis of Dave's conduct. Instead, it falls under the purview of the Office of Police Accountability to address Orderer's unprofessional behavior. Orderer, who was pulled from patrol in September 2023 and reassigned to a non-operational position, now faces potential termination pending a disciplinary hearing that's scheduled to take place on the 4th of March. Now, the video of Orderer callously discussing Janvi's death not only added fuel to the fire, but also raised serious questions about the culture within Seattle police. She was 26 anyway. She had limited value. That's what Orderer said in this video, which went viral on the social media last year. Seattle local media had reported that speed was the primary cause of the collision, as the other cop in question, Dave's high-speed response, did not provide sufficient time for Janvi to detect, address and avoid the impending hazard. The officer did not have a siren continuously activated, instead opting to chirp it at the intersection. While his emergency lights were on, the lack of a continuous siren and the excessive speed raised critical questions about the urgency and necessity of such a high-speed response. In a memo to Seattle police, prosecutors argued that there was not enough evidence to prove Dave showed a conscious disregard for others' safety. The decision not to press criminal charges hinges on Washington state law's requirement to prove a case beyond any reasonable doubt. The release of the body cam footage featuring Orderer's remarks, as we said, had triggered international outrage. Lawmakers both in the US and among the Indian American community condemned the behavior displayed in the video. Indian American Congressman Ro Khanna expressed his dismay, stating that every Indian immigrant's life has infinite value and anyone thinking otherwise should not be in law enforcement. Indian American Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal echoed the sentiment, calling the video appalling and demanding justice for Kandula's family. The Consulate General of India in San Francisco raised concerns over the incident, seeking a thorough investigation and action against those involved. The US government had assured India of a quick and fair investigation, but for now, the cop in question will walk free. All right, as we wrap up this edition of Global Lens, there is some good news, and this comes from India. There is good news for infertile couples in India who want to take the surrogacy route to have children. In a landmark decision, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has notified a significant change to the existing surrogacy rules that allow even single mothers to have children via surrogacy. The new rules also allow the use of one donor gamete, sperm or egg for a surrogate child. As per the new rules, if the district medical board certifies that either husband or wife constituting the intending couple suffers from a medical condition necessitating the use of donor gamete, then surrogacy using donor gamete is allowed, subject to the condition that the child to be born through surrogacy must have at least one gamete from the intending couple. Now, this particular amendment modifies the 2023 rule, which said that the couple undergoing surrogacy must have both gametes from the intending couple and donor gametes were not allowed. Also, it's a big win for single women, widows and divorcees who intend to go the surrogacy way. They will need to use their own eggs and donor sperms to avail surrogacy procedures. Previously, this rule restricted the pool of eligible persons to commission surrogacy. Under the 2023 surrogacy rules, the government had banned commissioning of surrogacy with the help of donor sperms or eggs Now, as per the new amended surrogacy rule, a couple intending to commission surrogacy can use donor egg or sperm, but for availing the exemption, a medical board constituted at the district level will have to give a certificate that the intending couple suffers from a medical condition necessitating the use of donor gametes. Surrogacy rules have earlier been challenged in various high courts and the Supreme Court of India, where the issue of donor gametes has been debated extensively. Last year, the Supreme Court had allowed a woman suffering from a medical complication to use donor eggs for surrogacy. Besides, the government policy had also been widely criticized for barring infertile couples from taking the surrogacy route. But clearly, now there has been course correction. Right, that's all the time we have on this edition of Global Lens. Thanks so much for watching. Do join us again at the same time tomorrow. Good night.
जानना है तो देखिए, समझना है तो सुनिए